multifamily has both more of a community dynamic within the industry. It sounds a little bit like Pollyanna, but it's an industry where we share a lot of information and we compete with our friends versus kind of brutally compete with each other. First of all, when I started in the industry, multifamily was not an institutional investment class.
Right.
Let's pause on that. It's the long game. Play the long game every day. Just remember that.
Welcome back to Season 4 of Multifamily Unpacked. Today, my guest is Matt Slepin. Matt is the Managing Director and Global Co-Head of Real Estate at ZRG, and also the host of Leading Voices in Real Estate. In his role, Matt has interviewed much of the industry's top talent and execs at many of the biggest names in the business. He's seen how multifamily teams have evolved from boots-on-the-ground generalists to centralized tech-enabled specialists, and what it takes to lead through that change. We talk about the rise of AI, human-first leadership, and the career moves that open doors in a shifting industry. Let's get into it. Matt, thank you for joining us. You're somebody who I've listened to for quite some time through your podcast. But for those who either aren't familiar with your podcast or perhaps don't know your day job, why don't you give us a little bit of your background and also lead us into kind of how you made your way into this world of multifamily?
Yeah. First of all, my day job, I'm a managing director and co-head of real estate at ZRG Partners. ZRG is one of the 10 largest talent-oriented firms, headhunter firms, recruiting firms, human capital firms in the world. And they bought my company, Terra Search Partners, 3.5 years ago. So I've been part of ZRG for 3.5 years. So in my day job, I'm a recruiter, executive recruiter, headhunter, whatever word you want to use for that. I've been in the business. I've had a career for 45 years or some scary number like that. And I started my career in the multifamily business. So that's right out of college. I was a multifamily lobbyist. And so that's what got me into this. And then about 7 years ago, along with the Urban Land Institute, I started a podcast called Leading Voices in Real Estate. You were my last guest, of course, and it was one of my favorite shows. I'll explain why later on. I have a lot of favorite children, though, but you were definitely one of them. And so that's overview.
I can't help but double click onto that then, because I don't know that I knew that detail of multifamily lobbying. Obviously, today I can imagine a lot of topics where lobbyists may be involved, and we've got a lot of legislation in the news in multifamily today. But what were the topics du jour when you came into the industry?
First of all, I was a lobbyist for co-op housing. So even more specific than multifamily generally. And co-op housing is a small niche in the multifamily world. And the niche was eclipsed. It was an older model to create new multifamily housing with ownership by the residents. Condos became created after co-ops. There's a lot of co-ops in New York and co-ops all over the country. And there's maybe a third, I'm going to make up a number, are low-income housing co-ops. So the part that I lobbied the most for was low-income housing co-ops. And then that got me started in a pathway towards multifamily because I found that I didn't like lobbying that much. And I wasn't purely a low-income housing person, but I was really interested in the business. And that got me into a business career in multifamily. And after a brief career in lobbying, I started at the National Housing Partnership, which was then the largest owner of multifamily, owner and manager of multifamily properties in the country. This is back in the mid 80s.
Sure. Interesting. Yeah. And I think that folks that obviously listen to this podcast understand the nuance, but I'm sure, like me, you often, as you describe to individuals, that you're in real estate. And then within that real estate, we're in the world of residential, and within that, the world of rental. And then within that, there's additional slivers, as you articulated, and each of them with their own nuanced opportunities and challenges. I'm curious, though, Matt, if we turn back to those earlier days in your career, are there any lessons that you take from that? We do have a lot of folks listen to this. Part of the kind of genesis of this podcast is we get to bring a lot of younger individuals into the rental housing space, and they often will ask, because the way they learn is through podcasts. They say, what podcasts are there for multifamily? So, of course, point them to you. What lessons early in your career do you take that you still keep with you today?
A bunch of lessons, of course. One is there's a lot of luck in business. You wind up in places that you didn't expect. So I was lucky to enter into the apartment business, as a sector of the commercial real estate world that was interesting to me. I didn't know about the rest of commercial real estate. And so one is kind of synchronicity, is how do you find the place you're going to wind up in? And for me, that really was apartments, although in my search career, it's broadened to all forms of real estate. And my podcast is all forms of real estate, which we could talk about. Multifamily being one of the most networked sectors in the real estate world, and one of the warmer sectors. It's about people. Industrial is not about people, right? It's about other things. I love industrial, I love retail, but multifamily has both more of a community dynamic within the industry. It's more of a cooperative, that's the wrong word, and it sounds a little bit like Pollyanna, but it's an industry where we share a lot of information and we compete with our friends versus kind of brutally compete with each other. So we could talk about what that means. But that one lesson and luck for me was that apartments are about half of my work career, and I love it.
Yeah.
The second thing is digging deep on stuff. When I joined the National Housing Partnership, I dug deep and I did congregate care. I was an early mover, and I was too early a mover, and I didn't know anything about seniors housing, which we then called this part of it was congregate care. And I spent 5 years in that business. And it was a fascinating business, but when it failed at NHP, I left it and didn't come back. And I always, to some degree, regretted it, because if I had dug deep and stuck with it, that I would have been successful in that. Would have been a really interesting career and an interesting world. So one thing is digging deep, another is the long game, is one of the themes I have throughout my career. And the wisdom that I've developed is, hey, you're going to be here for a while. And if you're going to be here for a while, and it's the long game, you better treat people well. You better really use your network, build a network that's lasting, because the folks you're going to work with today, you are going to know them for 40 years. What's that mean? That's fascinating. Maybe that's the biggest lesson.
That's a great lesson, especially to your point that you fell, and I and folks listening to this fell into a portion of the sector that, like you said, I wrote this down, warm and networked. And I agree, there is something to it that I found. I certainly didn't think I'd stay in it, much like most folks. Here I am. I can't imagine leaving. And therefore, those relationships really are investments, every single one of them. You're going to circle back and find the same individuals. Their titles may have changed, or yours, and the roles and the logos. But it's really important. And maybe if I unpack that just a bit, so in your role as headhunter, executive recruiter, you are constantly working through that network of individuals. But before I double click on that, I'm curious, you mentioned that you work broadly in real estate. Keeping the eye on the past here, I'm curious, Matt, how you've seen as an asset class, and even maybe just as how attractive it is to talent, how that's transitioned over time. I ask it through the lens of, I think when I was on your podcast, I talked about I grew up in multifamily. My father was an asset manager. And he and I talk all the time about how as an asset class, it's become more attractive, at least from a institutional capital flowing into it, right, into rental housing, the apartment industry. I'm curious from a talent perspective, if you've just seen any macro trends, whether it's industrial, office, retail, how that's shifted over the 40 years you've been in the industry.
So let's go into this, because it's a really great question. First of all, when I started in the industry, multifamily was not an institutional investment class.
Right.
Let's pause on that and let that weigh down. And
yeah, it's a good statement to start with.
Right. There was hardly an institutional real estate investment class to begin with back then, but the two property types that were institutional grade, whatever that means, was office and shopping malls.
Right.
And it's because a big investor could put it on the office building that was fancy, or the shopping mall that was a major mall. They could put it on the cover of their annual report and say, hey, we did this. And multifamily, there's almost no multifamily property that has national awareness, right?
Right.
So those were the two institutional real estate classes. And it took a long time for the business to change, and then it realized that multifamily was a safer investment than either of those, more predictable investment, and the capital dynamics of multifamily were more aligned.
Right.
And I wound up running an organization called the Multifamily Housing Institute prior to becoming a recruiter. And the Multifamily Housing Institute came out of the S&L crisis. It was an industry effort that said, how do we become more, how does multifamily become more of an investment class that's respected? This was right before the REITs. They were looking to create a database that would create transparency in the performance of multifamily. And so my job for 3 years was to try to create a database. This is back 25, 30 years ago, that could be used by the industry to show Wall Street and other capital sources that this is a safe investment. Reality eclipsed that business. We didn't need to do it. Plus, technologically, we couldn't do it. But that's a whole sideline. But that got me into thinking about what this all means. And multifamily over that period of time, and then in the last years, has been the premier investment class. Industrial's come close to it,
Right.
although it doesn't have the same dynamics as multifamily. But those have been the two darling investment classes for the last 20 years and predicted to go forward.
Yeah. You did this when I was on your show, so I'm going to continue to go off script for a minute, Matt, because you just keep piquing my interest. I'm going to put you on the spot. What are those financial dynamics that make multifamily so attractive? Where my brain goes, because I don't know the answer to this, I'm not leading the witness. Where my brain goes is I think perhaps rather than in hospitality where you can go from full occupancy to zero overnight, in office, obviously with COVID, we've seen this overhang where the 30-year, 15-year lease terms can actually be, it's a little protection, but it also can leave you really exposed that this cliff is coming. The lease length in multifamily has always been to me something that I thought perhaps is what institutional investors really liked, is that you can participate in the upside when rents are growing, but you're also protected a little bit from the downside. What other dynamics are you referencing when you think why over time multifamily has become the darling that it is?
I think it's just demographics, actually.
Okay,
There's a need for housing, right? And interest rates and the kind of the relationship between single family and multifamily, which has, I'm going to get this wrong, like 35 to 45% has been multifamily.
Right.
Within a band, maybe 33%. And what part is institutional multifamily versus mom and pop multifamily, which is a
Right.
whole other conversation. But the dynamics between single family and multifamily have driven this to be a business of necessity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Grocery anchored retail is a necessity business. You're going to have grocery stores, right? So that driver's just not going to go away and was really saved through COVID for the same reason. But multifamily has a long-term investment thesis, and it's going to be required. We could see the demographics. You could predict the demographics. The question is, do we overbuild at various points in time?
Correct. That stated. And then so your role in various forms, but definitely somebody who finds and allocates and places talent, is really thinking about how do we, manage, run, invest these assets. I'm curious, this segueing into kind of the theme of all of our content around role specialization, centralization. I'm curious if you go back in time and now it's becoming a institutional investable class. You mentioned obviously the emergence of REITs, which I would highlight. I think actually, Matt, the way I found you was you did a great podcast with Camden. I have to think that it must have been, was it Keith Oden or Rick Campo?
It was Keith Oden.
It was Keith. Okay, all right. It was Keith. The Den of Camden and Rick Campo. So you had Keith Oden, and in that, I found that fascinating. There's some really great observations for folks to listen to about the ability, the innovation of the REIT and the ability to invest from a single balance sheet. Love that podcast. But take us back then to the staffing needs. When you would be called up and somebody was saying, hey, this is what I'm looking for, who were maybe perhaps the people that we were striving to get on our team? Were they coming from the REITs? Were they coming from the asset manager side? And then just even down to the property level, did you see this early emergence of kind of really standardized property management proliferating across the industry?
So let's think about a couple different trends together. And you and I talked about this somewhat, although I was teeing it up for you to answer the question. So now we'll flip this. And we'll go back to NHP because it was interesting. NHP was then the largest owner of apartment buildings. And they hired a guy, and I mentioned this on my show, or on our show together, named Lindsay Crump. And Lindsay Crump was the first head of property management for NHP. And again, they were the largest owner. And there were not that many other really large owners. And Lindsay came, I think, from the bowling alley business. And the model was you put 3 people on a property or 4 or 5 people on a property, and they report to district people, and they report to regional people, and they report to management people who reports to a central office. So it was this massively decentralized model. And let's play with 2 different thoughts here. So that's property management. And if you make that better and better, then we're scared to put computers on site. I remember this. I lived through this. We were terrified to put computers on site because they would just watch pornography was the fear. That was it. They didn't have phones where they could already do it, so it didn't matter. But whatever the deal was. But so how do you perfect the model of decentralization, which was what it was all about? At the same time, the most successful people in the business were like the merchant builders. They were deal people. There was nothing more than deal people in the business. So the merchant builders, Trammell Crow Residential, Lincoln Property Company, these people were the behemoths of the industry, and they knew how to build. So there was a transaction version of this, and there was also the property management version, which we just talked about, those 2 models. All of a sudden, the REITs came along. And the REITs flipped that on its head. And the flip on its head was, I don't have 70 properties. I have one balance. I don't have 70 balance sheets. I have one balance sheet that might include 70 properties or whatever it is. Now I have to think about it as a business and not as a group of assets. That changes both the attitudes towards the deal people, because once you're big enough, the next deal doesn't move the needle very far. What moves the needle is how you own and operate this portfolio that you have that you wind up keeping for a while. And between that and then technology breakthroughs, the concept of the fully decentralized model got flipped on its head. And it hasn't been worked through yet. So we're still in the middle of that. You're a lot in the middle of that because your technology is one of the ones that help move that needle. So then the question is, what kind of people run these companies that are largely a big pool of existing assets versus deal people? So then now we need CEOs who know how to run a business. And then we need people up and down that organization. And the nature of those people will change over that period of time.
That's a great answer. And yeah, again, I think that folks need to understand that impetus, that starting point. And again, I'm very grateful for the REITs. And unsurprisingly, to your point, and as we've unpacked, the REITs were the first ones to really push funnel into that centralization journey. So thinking through that lens then of, okay, we now need to have operators, not just deal makers, not just the transactional side. I'm curious, those conversations that you've had over time, and this is, again, maybe a little unscripted, but how many folks had that hands-on experience, and is that why perhaps we've seen a lot of homegrown talent? I think there's certain organizations like a Camden, like an Archstone, that, man, I see them all over the board, right? Like, it's not surprising to me on any given week that I'll meet an executive on an intro call, and turns out they were at one of 5 organizations in the early 90s. So I'm curious how you saw that talent, where it started, because I would imagine similar to centralization today, you were joking a second ago about property management being, you throw a couple people on site and there's a regional manager. I was laughing because that still is 90% of how the industry operates. We're still very early innings, to your point of really moving to a centralized model. But yet, again, take me back to this time in which we moved from deal makers to actual kind of operational executives, more of the Lindsay Crumps of the world coming in and running multifamily. But I would imagine most folks in your job, when someone hires you, is to find the talent that exists inside of the organizations, inside of the NHPs, and move them elsewhere. So is that what the early dynamics were like? A lot of competition for a small group of folks?
It was both, yes. There's both competition to bring in those people from the other organization that's better. I use this word all the time. I want to find a candidate who has a playbook from an organization that I really respect, and that also might be a different way of doing business than you have in a company. So let's explore a couple of themes. One theme at a company is that people love to have longevity of their senior staff. So I had this great meeting at one of the companies that we talked about in our last conversation. And when I go around the country, I'll visit with a client. And this particular meeting was great. They brought me into their boardroom and the whole executive team was there. And so we just had a chat. Hey, let's talk to Matt. So it was really cool. And one of the things that these 7 white guys, all of whom were over 50 years old, said to me in that meeting was, we have a strength, but we also have a problem. The strength is our longevity and how long we've worked together. But that's also our problem, and our investors are starting to get upset with us because we need, and it's not diversity because it was literally all 50-year-old plus white guys. So there was some diversity, but when you've worked together too long, you have no outside perspectives. That's the part
Right.
that I care about, as well as some diversity of perspective. But diversity of perspective, what does that mean for a company? So that's thought number one in solving this. But let me also, you're making me think of another part in multifamily management that's another theme here that's both an opportunity and a challenge. And one of the themes in the apartment business, old school, but still the same school today, is where do people get started in this business? And this is often not people who take a job as a leasing agent on site in property management. Three-quarters of the people who I've interviewed in that multifamily property management business came into the business that way. And
Right.
of that group of folks, a bunch of them get a little bit lazy and seduced because the money's good, the promotions are good. They either don't finish college,
Right.
half of them don't finish college.
Right.
I remember something that the Irvine company did. This is now 20 years ago, and it was a big deal and maybe the wrong deal the way they did it. But it was, we're not going to promote anyone to vice president or whatever the title was who doesn't have a college degree.
Right.
But again, and that damaged a bunch of their people in hierarchy who came into the business. One of them is a good friend of mine and might be of yours as well, who then got an MBA, not having gotten a college degree. Really interesting thing. And and I knew the pathway that one could do that. So that broke that rule for this person who became an entrepreneur in the business, did an amazing job. But that limitation, there's a Peter Principle limitation that we have a whole lot of really talented, really wonderful people, but then they don't have kind of the academic background or the intellectual background to know how to do management at a higher level. So then thinking through what that higher level looks like, we are still challenged in the industry.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Yeah, and I think that that transition continues to happen. You referenced earlier the pushback on bringing computers on site. Obviously, we're in an era now where technology is rapidly advancing. There's AI, there's those. Everyone recognizes, I think, more than ever the need to embrace it. But similarly, the talent dynamic continues to be one that I observe of this balancing act of we're going to bring in non-multifamily executives who have great consulting backgrounds and educational backgrounds, but they may not understand or appreciate the operational kind of wherewithal that's required. And so they're often, I see it quite frequently, a disconnect within organizations, particularly large organizations, of kind of professional management and operational management. And as you described it, often they came from two entirely different backgrounds. I think where you see really great operational excellence and great cultures is when you can marry those two things. Hey, we're going to bring best in class hospitality level experiences to our industry, but we're also going to marry that with boots on the ground experience from multifamily operations. So Matt, something you've mentioned. Oh, go ahead.
Hang on one sec, because I interrupted the answer to your question with the story about leasing people being promoted up in. And the question is, where do the leaders come from for our companies? And when I think of the leaders, so that progression of a lot of the talent can't get to the next level. So that's one of the limitations of the existing pool. And a lot of the existing pool 20 years ago were deal people. And I call them the cowboys, right? Deal people, cowboys, whatever those different words are. So who would know how to run a $20 billion company that's a public company? Who has that skill set? Yeah. And so some of them became part of the industry, and now we've grown people like that. But also we've brought them in from other sectors that have similar behavior patterns. So there may be more sophisticated people in hospitality, which you mentioned a few minutes ago. Aimco was famous 20 some odd years ago when they were the biggest. They bought NHP, by the way, the company that I worked at. But Aimco brought in a lot of people from the rental car industry, and they were more educated people who knew how to work in a very hierarchical organization, but they brought a different kind of sophistication and different experiences that have also added to our toolbook in the apartment business.
Yeah, said. I think it's why you mentioned before the demographics of multifamily continue to support it being a great asset. I think for the line of work that you're in, we will continue to have talent management challenges where individuals are trying to find that unicorn hire with just the right degree of experience in all the fields. And now I want to unpack this. Still looking in the past, well, let's look just recent past, when you first heard about this new concept of centralization and role specialization. So tell us about that and how it was described to you as what was novel, unique, or the need shifting from traditional property management.
So if you take that old hierarchy, the question is what can be centralized? And
Right.
so the first places I heard about this were, I'll suggest some disconnect and then I'll suggest some early seeds. So some disconnect was a bunch of the organizations that I mentioned, before, like Trammell Crow Residential. They had regional partners. Lincoln had regional partners. All the regional partners had a regional CFO. So the accounting and reporting would come up through the regional office, and someone would be sitting in Philadelphia, or someone would be sitting in DC, or someone would be sitting in San Francisco, and that regional partner would manage their management people. And then somehow that might be rolled up to a central company at TCR or Lincoln or whoever they might be. And but everyone did it their own way. That drove me nuts. It didn't make any sense. Even then, it didn't make any sense. So that's kind of story number one of things that had to be fought to make the changes that have occurred in the industry. Then there were early seeds of companies getting ready to do this. One was BRE years ago. I was sitting with Connie and Ed, who were kind of president and CEO of that organization. And there was the concept, okay, we're going to start some hubs here. And they ran towards that on an early basis. And that's now Essex, and Essex is one of the early adopters to this.
I was going to say that sounds, yeah, I've heard this.
Right. Archstone was one of the early adopters to let's figure out how to do this. EQR, early, they had 3 regional presidents, is the way they decentralized. We can't be this big and know how to do it, but so they had 3 regional presidents. I'm assuming that they then had centralized accounting. So the first thing that centralizes is accounting, because people use one of the 2, 3, 4 accounting systems to make that work. So that would have been the early parts of it. But then past accounting, maybe revenue management would be early. So you're now taking little pieces of this
Right.
and making that central. Not everything can be central. We know that. You need humans, and you need humans
100%.
at sites. The balance is still being discovered.
100%. Yeah, I think we're, just to point to something you just said, I think we're swinging a little ways over here of AI is going to do it all. And I think that the organizations that are leaning into the, okay, yes, we're going to embrace AI, but the human still. So maybe let me use that as a segue into this question. You've now been able to be a part of multiple disruptive technologies, whether that was bringing computers on site. Then in the early 2000s, it was let's move from those computers now should be running cloud-based systems, right, where I'm going to log in. And today, of course, now we're seeing this modern technology of AI. Matt, as you think about these disruptive technologies, first I'd like to understand what are the reasons to not change, right? What are some of the headwinds or impediments that might cause somebody to not embrace a new disruptive technology right out the gates?
So let's think of a couple things that are traditional in our business. I already spoke about the regional partner model that, say, Lincoln and Trammell Crow Residential had. That makes it pretty difficult if you have a regional partner who's empowered, and part of their compensation, which drives a lot of these things, compensation and power and control is decentralized in a lot of these businesses. And taking more control and still enabling your local partners to be entrepreneurial is a balancing act and a trick. And we talked about it in the recent podcast with the new co-CEOs of Lincoln Property Company, who are finding a new balance within their organization where everything had been decentralized. So that's place number one where it's difficult to do these things. Place number two where it's difficult to do these things is third-party management, which drives a lot of the apartment business, as well as other forms of commercial real estate. But if I'm serving 30 different owners in my portfolio, will those owners all agree to the same technologies? Will they tech stack? Will they agree to the same accounting software? The answer is no. So I have to have some diversity among them. And will they accept going through a call center where the phone call fielded might be fielded and the person answering the call will send them to 5 different properties, only one of which is owned by me. So that's a headwind. And then the final headwind is I'm a sole owner, but I have everything in different partnerships. So I have 50 different partnerships for my 50 properties. That's 50 different owners, even though I'm one entity. And then how do I both account for that and how do I justify that kind of sharing? So those headwinds make it difficult to do this. One other headwind is it's relatively easy in a concentrated, either a humongous portfolio or a concentrated portfolio in one region. But if I have a portfolio that's scattered across the country, I don't know what to do with it. So it's harder to centralize there. Oh, and last point is what do you do about affordable housing, which has yet a separate set of dynamics, and that might be a third of the portfolio of institutional scale real estate.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, and we are seeing those turn up as real world impediments to your point, and blockers and headwinds. I think like any challenge, therein lies the opportunity. And I think that the opportunity is too great today with the mega managers that we have to not figure it out, because you go back to your story related to Lindsay Crump, right, and the size, and you just look at it and think there's got to be some economies of scale here. I completely agree. It's similar to what's happening in the automobile industry right now, where the structure itself is impeding the Fords and GMs of the world from mirroring the Tesla Rivian sales model, because they have contracts with they make the money from the franchises, right, from the dealerships, and they have that. It's all ingrained into it. But I think that if these mega managers, there's just too much incentive for them to figure out how to centralize. So we're obviously seeing that in some inside baseball, but you're right that there's some real impediments. The incentives for them are much harder than for Camden, who owns everything, and cross-selling is great and shared resources are great.
The answer is not going to be either one size fits all or that centralization fully is the answer. Right? The answer is a balancing act, and that balancing act will be bespoke to each company, and you're going to be flexible to go figure that out. So that's point number one. Point number two, a story I tell often. I was on a bike trip. We were climbing the Canadian Rockies with a backroads trip. And I was with my wife, Diane, and there was a couple from Pittsburgh. And the couple from Pittsburgh rode a tandem bike, and they were old. They're probably my age now, right? But they were somewhere in their 70s or 60s, rather, because that's where I am. And they were really interesting, quirky couple. I said, where do you live? What do you do? The guy goes, I own apartment buildings in Pittsburgh. I said, whoa, okay, I'm Matt Slepin. Like, I'm into apartment buildings. Let's talk about this. So we talked about it, and he owned, I'm going to make this up, 5 kind of big apartment buildings in Pittsburgh. And so I talked to him about turnover, and I said, hey, what's your turnover of residents? What's your turnover of staff? Which we know is about 50% on both staff and residents average in the apartment business. No. His resident turnover might have been 20% per year, and his staff turnover might have been 5% per year. Like, you go to work for him and you die in the job.
Wow.
Right. Now, he had efficiencies and he had pricing power that beat anything you could do. So what does that business mean? What's the right answer there? And for him, and he was centralized, right? Because he had 5 properties in one area. But anyhow, the answers aren't always what they seem to be. And the trends don't go just blindly in one direction fully. It becomes a balancing act at the end of the day, is my belief.
I think that those trends that you referenced, we come to the modern day here and kind of what we're seeing in the market. Again, highly recommend everybody listen to your podcast, Leading Voices in Real Estate. And when listening to the episodes this year, there's some trends. There's centralization, as we've noted, AI, as we've noted. And then also you have these leaders on that are very human-centric leadership style. As you talk through these conversations with these individuals, how do you land on these themes? And then maybe just tying that into your last statement about kind of the nuance. It almost would appear to me, I've said before, as a technologist right now, it's an amazing time to be running a business. It's a scary time, it's a hard time, but AI gives you so many new opportunities. It's a challenge, it's a threat, it's an opportunity. To me, it would seem similar that it's a very trying, difficult, hard, and exciting time to be in real estate, which is with the changing operating model, the introduction of AI, That third theme of human-centric leadership would seem to be more important than ever. And I think the example you just gave would validate that you don't have to be a mega manager. Even a 5-property manager might have a unique opportunity to outperform.
Absolutely true. And also, if you think of where money is to be made, the person who has 5 properties and sells them all, they're going to make a lot of dough. And a middle manager in another company is going to have 50-year career, may never get to the place that person who did 5 great deals would be.
That to me would seem to be an opportunity. So you get to help fill executive roles. As we discussed, often these executive roles, these leadership roles, are from folks who have proven it, have done it, have earned their way up in our industry, as we've said, in different types of ladders. But what advice would you give then to those who are maybe mid-career, they're traversing these different opportunities?
One of the things is different comments here. One is it's not about money. So we were talking about money as that prior example, and money's really cool, and some people are going to get really rich, and other people are going to get really comfortable and retire well. And so what does that mean? And so one thing I always think about is there are some folks who chase getting rich as their career goal. They should be brokers. Let them go do that, or massive entrepreneurs, and that's really going to work for them. But for most of us, what's the role for most of us in this? One is find a place that you have passion and that you love the business, and find a role that you have passion for and you're really good at. I had trouble finding the role for myself within this business. It took me years, and I became a headhunter, which is a weird role in the business, right? This is not the average role for somebody. Everyone might think they might need to be a deal person or an investment person because that's the sexy part of the business. But for most people, it might be, for other people, it might be asset management, it might be property management. So what fits what their personality success rate role is going to be to what part of the industry where they're going to thrive and enjoy themselves. And it might be the technology side of it. It just totally depends.
I would say to that point, just briefly to interrupt you, I think that right now many operators I talk to are looking for folks with technology experience. And to your point, that probably historically would have been viewed as a demotion almost, right? Of, oh, that's IT. But now there are many folks that took a detour into technology that are operations leaders. So anyway, just wanted to validate that comment.
And you can't be technology backward to be successful in your career. You better be. So things that I have loved. So a couple of these. One, for me, I have a lot of curiosity, thank God, because I'd never get through the podcasts I do, and I'd never get through the interviews I do. I've interviewed 10,000 people. I've done the 10,000-hour thing, and luckily I'm curious instead of just goal-oriented. Let me double-click on that for a minute, and this is one of the mantras I tell people, is I do 90-minute interviews as a recruiter. Most recruiters do 30-minute, 45-minute, 60 minutes, and you can get it done in 30 minutes. I could figure out if someone's a candidate or not. And if they're not a candidate in that 30 minutes, I should just hang up. I should just hit the red button on the thing and say, sorry, you're done. Over. But I do 90 minutes. Now, people tell me I waste time because that other 60 minutes is now a waste of time because it's not helping the client. I'm going to learn as much as I can about their organization, their prior boss, what they love, what they learned, what they did, and then they're not a candidate. But I got all this data, which is very valuable, plus I'm making a relationship with them, and I will talk to them again. One thing is to find the area that you love, to take the time, and it's not about the direct hit, not the direct line to success. It might be a more circuitous route to get to the goals that you have. And for me, that like extra 60 minutes in an interview is a commitment that I made that after 20 years paid off and was just the way I did it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think if I were to then ask as a follow-up to that, Matt, if you're thinking about that's something that you've invested in for the last 40 years, and really to your point, this 20-year ROI, what advice would you give to somebody newer into the industry who's coming in, and perhaps in particular, as you think about the leadership opportunities that will be presenting themselves, where would you encourage them to focus their efforts? Is it learning from individuals? You have this unique opportunity. Not everybody gets to interview folks for 90 minutes all the time. So is it just being open-minded to lateral moves in their career? Is it more about focusing on the areas in which the industry is headed, like technology? I'm just curious, if someone were starting their career in multifamily today, and even if you put yourself in those shoes, what would you do differently to align with where the industry is headed?
Yeah, so a couple different thoughts. So one is, once you go, okay, I kind of like this industry, then don't dabble, dig deep and stay with it and have the realization that you're probably going to be in this industry for the next 30 years. And what does that mean for you? And what does it mean for your relationships? What does it mean for your learning? What's it mean for your behavior? Because you can spend more time investing in the early years. Find the role within the industry that fits your personality, your skill set, your intellectual capabilities, and all the rest of that. So what's the role that's going to fit? How can you keep learning every day on the job and get better at that job? Don't rest. One of the things that I found through each of the conversations with amazing leaders in the real estate business is these people are ambitious, they're smart, they're relentless. Not everyone is ambitious, smart, and relentless. You don't have to be. You could be half of that, but how are you always pressing your career a little bit harder? And with a little bit more ambition than you might have. Go to your areas of discomfort. That's another thing I talk to people about. Learn in the areas that you don't know about so you have a broader perspective. Context is really important from my perspective, which is I know my job, I do my job really well. I don't know how it fits in, but it doesn't matter because I do my job. I'm a widget. Don't be a widget. If you're a widget, you're in danger. But most of the listeners to your podcast are already curious and they're going somewhere. They wouldn't be spending the time listening to this stuff.
Yeah, said. I love that last point because that's something even at Funnel I struggle with. It had one of my leaders recently remarked to me that he needed help trying to connect some of the team members to the company goals. And I thought, I don't think I've ever had that challenge in my career. I think I've always intellectually wanted to understand how important what I did was for where the company was going.
And one thing I say to my team, which fits the same theme, so this is easier for me to talk about, which is we have a search. We have to fill a job. We have to get 5 candidates who are worthy of the job to the client, and then we move on to the next thing. That's pretty straightforward, but if we push it hard and we play 2, 3, 4 level chess, is every conversation we have with everybody, not the 2, 3, 4 candidates that the client sees, but those other ones who I'm spending 90 minutes with, how are those valuable? How are those adding to your knowledge about the business? What are we learning through doing the search? What are we learning in the search so that we're going to get the next search and the next search because we've become the experts in this vein of the real estate? And if you always approach your job that way, you always approach for the what's next, I'm looking at what's next, then you become more strategic. You're looking for context, you're looking for wisdom. And if you're always pushing towards those things, which are flaky, soft words, but I think everyone will understand what I'm talking about in the context of their job.
Yeah, love that. And I also, Matt, want to just reiterate something you said a minute ago of if you're going to be in the industry, and in my experience, if somebody lasts more than 18 months, you're probably in it for 30 years. And I think that way too many people underestimate that fact and don't therefore invest in the relationships, invest in the knowledge, most importantly, as you just articulated. And it's remarkable to me how many people I know have been in the industry for 10 plus years and they're not experts in it yet, right? They still aren't curious about the latest laws and the latest impact of the supply and et cetera, et cetera. So I think there is a common thread with top performers, be that in technology or operations or asset management. They're really passionate and curious about the vertical that they serve in. So I loved that advice. You might as well, you're going to be here. You might as well invest in it.
And if you're in sales, which I guess I'm in, if you come to it and said, hey, you must have a great network. The network is part of it, and the ability to connect with people and remember them, that's a bit of it. I'd say only a bit of it. And I think for the best salespeople, and I'm sure it's the case at Funnel, is they know the heck out of their business. So that when they're talking to a client, they're not talking about how great Funnel is. They're talking about problem solving for that client. And to problem solve for that client, you have to understand the heck out of operations or whatever it is that you're entering into. And to understand the perspective through the person you're selling to, engage at that level, not, hey, what did you think about the baseball score last night? That's not really interesting. Salespeople are, oh, that's how I warm them up. I like, let's dive right into the substance of this thing, discuss it deeply intellectually. We will have so much fun. That's my version of it.
I love that. Really well said. Matt, we obviously could dive in and keep discussing for hours. We're at time. So what I'd like to do is just to have folks get to know you a bit better. We like to end with a few quick rapid fire questions. So the first one we like to ask, Matt, is we've got this little billboard out here. I'm in Tampa, Florida, right outside my window. What's an opinion that you feel so strongly about that you'd put up on a billboard? That could be multifamily related or just otherwise.
Yeah, it fits what we've talked about. It's the long game. Play the long game every day. Just remember that.
Love that. All right. If you could retire and work on a philanthropic cause, Matt, what would that be?
At the moment, I'd say two. So one is hunger. So I am co-founder of an organization that's a food recovery organization in Northern California. And so hunger is a painful one. Housing, of course, but also at the moment, we're doing 2 podcasts in a row on disasters. And gosh, we have an increasing number of disasters because of climate, and it's just coming and coming. What just happened in Texas last week? It's going to be an earthquake in California. There were fires in California. There were fires that came to my back door years ago. Those disasters, we're just ill prepared to deal with that stuff. So those come to mind top.
Amazing. If you wouldn't mind sending us some information on the organization that you're involved in on the hunger side, we'd love to put that in the show notes. And then last 2 here, finish this sentence. The future of multifamily is...
long. It's going to be there. It's demand, right? It's need. It's housing.
That's really great. I love that you tied that together from the beginning to the end, Matt. And then what's a value or principle? You've got your team, and you mentioned you're playing the long game. So what's a value or principle that you refuse to compromise on?
I'm pretty transparent, and transparency cuts both ways. It can scare people. Being direct and transparent scares people. It's not nice, but it's usually nice because it's the truth. So I won't compromise on that.
I love that. That is great. Matt, I have enjoyed our conversations. We've talked more on podcasts than in person at this point, but I really enjoyed getting to know you, and am grateful for your work that you do in this industry that, as we both said, we both love and can be doing for a while. So thank you, Matt.
Thank you. Back at you. And we will do this over a meal sometime soon, I hope.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. If this episode got you thinking, here's the next step. Join us at the Forum, the best conference in multifamily, March 23rd to 26th at the JW Marriott Camelback Inn in Scottsdale. I can assure you Forum is not the average conference. It's built for multifamily executives who are rethinking how teams, technology, and operations come together to deliver standout renter and team experiences. If that sounds like you, this is where you need to be. Registration's open now at the link in the show notes. Early bird pricing runs through November 2nd, and a heads up, Forum sells out every year. Don't wait. Grab your seat at the best rate today. We'll see you in Scottsdale.